Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And today we're joined by Dr. Andrew Weaver from North Carolina State University.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's good to be here. So you want to tell us a little bit about the grazing program you've got going on down there at NC State?
Yeah. So we've got a flock of Katahdins as well as Dorsets here on campus. We use that flock to really serve the three purposes, three pillars, you could say, of the land grant mission. That would be research, teaching, and extension outreach education. And so the way we manage those flocks and what we're doing there is to serve those reasons and those purposes. And so grazing is a big part of that. And so we're trying to explore grazing systems and opportunities that other producers around the state may be able to implement. And we're trying a few things out, really at a demonstration type level, not a formal research project per se. But over the last about year and a half or so, we've been looking at annual forage systems using a crabgrass and then ryegrass rotation to manage our use. And so that's been pretty exciting and a fun project to work on. And I can go into a little bit in terms of planting and things like that. The crabgrass we put in May. Last year we put it in first week of May. We actually put it in this past week, about let's say May 20th or so. Here this year, that it takes about 45 to 60 days before it's ready to graze. And so we're look to get onto that, mid-July or so, or at least by mid-July, and then can graze that for 60, 70 days or so. And then we terminate that, or it terminates itself once we get a freeze. And then we transition over to the ryegrass, plant that in the fall. And typically don't get a lot of fall growth and grazing with ryegrass, but come springtime, it's a pretty rapid grower and one that provides a lot of nutrients, a lot of energy in that springtime, early season growth. And so it's worked out well for us this year. It was the first year we did it.
You're grazing that pretty hard until you're ready for your ryegrass to come on then, or your crabgrass, I mean.
The ryegrass.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say really it's actually we're using the ryegrass to get onto pastures before the fescue's ready.
Okay.
And so we still got perennial pastures. I mean, that's the foundation of our grazing system. But the ryegrass allowed us this year to probably start grazing 2 to 3 weeks earlier than what we would have been able to do had we just relied on the fescue alone. And so we were able to graze that ryegrass. And then we jumped over to fescue for about a week, 10 days, and let that ryegrass regrow. And then we're able to graze those fields, those pastures a second time here this spring.
Okay.
So with the fescue, for those that are listening, you're in central and North Carolina. And so in those fescue pastures, when do you start to see those kind of wake up, come alive, that you'd feel comfortable getting on and grazing?
It's so dependent year to year. Typically by the latter part of March, we're able to start grazing. Certainly by the 1st of April, we're getting quite a bit of growth. Everything is very mature at this point in the year. And so, you're really April's kind of the peak of that spring flush. And so it's growing like crazy. We had, even on the ryegrass, we had a 21 to 28 day rest on that before we were back on it again.
And so like on the crabgrass side of things, I think, where I grew up, it's not necessarily a beneficial species. So I guess how did you come across it in terms of digestibility, maybe some protein levels? What are you seeing in that standing forage, and maybe some reason to plant that and graze sheep on it?
Yeah, so the crabgrass idea, I can't take credit for that. There's actually a couple other faculty members here, Dr. Harmon, Dr. Poor, Johnny Rogers, Dr. Siciliano, They had been working with crabgrass for a number of years and saw some exciting opportunity with it. And they were using it primarily in cattle or horse systems. And so I figured we'd give it a try with sheep. It's a forage that it isn't annual, but it reseeds itself very well. So in many ways, it kind of acts like a perennial. Once you get a seed bank established in the soil, you may have a nice crabgrass stand and without even planting it in future years. And so it has advantages in that regard. It's a forage that has relatively high concentration of energy. July 15th, the last year, it tested 74%. Which allowed us to provide our ewes. We put some open ewes out there that we were looking to breed about September 1, and we grazed them on that crabgrass leading up to the breeding season, and allowed us to get some good energy into them over the middle part of the summer when fescue is not very active. Protein was a bit lower. That's probably where we saw the shortfall, 8-9%. But just keep in mind, we didn't apply no fertilizer, no nitrogen. Had we put some nitrogen on it, maybe those protein levels would have been a bit higher.
And so you're in a kind of a following grass system that could probably benefit from some nitrogen. Are you applying any nitrogen to the annual ryegrass, or is it just trying to recycle what's being produced by that annual grass through the sheep and then back out onto that forage?
So we haven't put any nitrogen out so far, and I guess we've gambled, and it's worked out well so far. I'm not gonna sit here and say that it's gonna work forever, and maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. I can't answer that question at this point. We are grazing relatively intensively. We're trying to keep our stock density relatively high, and so we are trying to concentrate nutrients. And disperse those nutrients across that field and recycle those. So we have not applied any lime, any nitrogen at this point. We have taken soil tests. We took one set last spring, I should say. We took another set about 2 weeks ago. I haven't seen those results yet, but I'm kind of curious to see where we're at after a year with those annual forages and no extra supplementation in terms of nutrient application.
So you covered the nutrition aspect of it. In terms of other health areas or improvements in the management, we know parasites are a huge issue in our sheep flocks, and certainly where you're at there in the southeast, something that you guys worry about quite a bit. So we've kind of talked in the past. If you want to share a little bit on the possibilities of breaking up that life cycle with kind of a double annual system, 2 annuals back to back, and how that may benefit compared to our traditional perennial pasture.
Yeah, and all of this is really preliminary data at this point. Like I said, it's really more of a demonstration. We haven't conducted a formal research project with any sort of control at this point. We've been pretty happy. We have taken fecals while the animals have been out. We take a fecal once a month, just kind of assess where they're at while they're out grazing the annuals, and been pleased with where those fecals have stayed. Haven't had a whole lot of parasite issues out on them so far. That's not saying maybe in future years we wouldn't, but we are. We're terminating the crabgrass, and then before we plant the ryegrass, and we're letting those pastures really rest from mid-September on through when we start grazing about March 1st. So they don't have anything on them for quite a period of time there. And then, we terminate the ryegrass to get the crabgrass established early enough that we can actually take advantage of it. Sometimes, especially in the spring we're having this year, that ryegrass would just continue to grow. So we got to get the crabgrass in the ground. And so we did terminate the ryegrass and then allow those pastures to rest again. And so, are we breaking up the life cycle? Maybe, maybe not. We'll continue to look into this and see what comes of it. But been pretty happy with relatively low fecal egg counts up to this point in our animals that have been on those forages. And at the end of the day, really, the goal is we want to make sure first and foremost that we meet the animals' nutrient requirements. And so getting them the energy and protein they need is kind of the first step to combating parasitism. And so I think using these annual forages and getting those nutrients into them at those key life stages can do a lot in and of itself to allow them to respond to parasite exposure.
And you are utilizing some minimal tillage tools in both establishments, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So our goal with this is that the small farmer, the small producer, could implement the planting establishment strategies that we're utilizing. So we have not used a drill for either ryegrass or crabgrass. We've done a broadcast drag system, and so we go out there. We do spray and terminate the previous stand, and then we allow that to rest for a couple weeks, and then we will drag those pastures and then broadcast the seed and then come back and drag it again. And that's all we've done. And we were a little bit concerned with the ryegrass, and if we had enough seed soil contact with that, with the crabgrass residue that was left over last summer. And it was slow to get going, but really came on as the spring got going here this year, and we're pretty happy with the establishment that we did get with that.
And when you say drag, is that like an old drag Hera or?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so
And that would be a chain drag.
You're just putting those tines down in to where they're just kind of just knocking dirt around a little bit, not really a full tillage pass or anything.
Yep, just scratching the surface.
Okay.
So my other question, you touched a little bit on the annual ryegrass, and you're coming back to it at like 28 days there in the spring. Are those continuous grazes? Are those fairly intensive rotational grazing passes? And then what kind of recovery are you seeing on the crabgrass in terms of days to return to grazing in the summer?
Yeah, so it's for both the ryegrass. Well, this spring, I'd say we were in the 21 to 28 day time period. The crabgrass, we were right about 28 to 30 days, right about a month, and it varied. This spring, we kept our paddock size for about 50 ewes and 90 lambs. We were about between a half acre and 3/4 of an acre for 2 to 3 day allocations. Went in, tried to graze half, leave half, and get them on to the next pasture. We did try to leave some residual there to help promote and accelerate the regrowth. So we did not graze it all the way to the ground. And so, yeah, somewhere, it varied a little bit as the spring went on, but that kind of in that ballpark is where we were at.
And you were grazing like lactating ewes on that ryegrass, correct?
That's correct. We did have the lactating ewes out there, both our Katahdins and our Dorsets grazed on that ryegrass. The ryegrass tested 76 to 78 TDN and about 14 to 15 crude protein.
So did you offer any type of like creep on pasture for those lambs?
No creep, but we did supplement the ewes 1 pound per head per day through lactation. And of course, as the lambs get older, they start stealing some as well. But after testing the forage and realizing what kind of quality we had there, we cut down on our supplementation to the ewes, and historically in years past, we've always provided a creep feeder on pasture for the lambs, but we stopped that this year, knowing the quality of the forage that we had.
So with those moves, how often are you guys trying to rotate through that? So are you on like a 3-day rotation? I know Tom's mentioned in past episodes he's moving sheep every day. What are you guys trying to shoot for?
Yeah, somewhere in that 2 to 3 day range. We have a lot of other obligations. Our farm staff has a lot of other things they're committed to as well in terms of teaching class and labs and things like that. And so, we didn't necessarily do every day, but I'd say on average it was about every 2 to 3 days.
I guess, do you have any other annuals you'd like to try out? Are you pleased enough with this stuff that you're going to keep this in rotation?
That's a great question.
Would this work for you guys deal with a lot of end of fight issue in your fescue, and is this a possibility to kind of break up that cycle to renovate some pastures and still keep some high quality forage in front of those sheep?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. And I forgot to mention that earlier. In terms of using crabgrass as an opportunity to get off some toxic fescue, I think that has a lot of potential just in and of itself. It allows you to graze in July and August and keep those animals on a plant that doesn't have that toxin. And even though fescue isn't as big of a problem in our sheep, there still could be some impact. And so anything we can do to minimize that could potentially be beneficial. So that's certainly another advantage of using something like crabgrass. In terms of looking at other annuals, there's a lot of ideas and a lot of different people use different ones. And I get some ideas, and sometimes I think they're good ideas, and sometimes I realize that they're not so good ideas. One of the challenges with both crabgrass and ryegrass is they do spread quite a bit of their own seed. And so, crabgrass, you plant crabgrass a couple of years, then you may never have to plant it again. When you have that established seed bank. And so there is some concern if say you have a crabgrass in a rotation and then you want to go back to like a novel fescue, there's some concern that that crabgrass could potentially outcompete the fescue early on, in that first year, and maybe limit its establishment and cause some problems there. And so generally, Dr. Poor has done a lot of work. He had a grad student a few years ago that actually looked into renovation strategies, going to novel fescue and other types of smother crops worked pretty well. Something that would shade out and outcompete something like crabgrass, and get that taken care of so you can get that fescue established then the following year, and minimize any competition from other grasses.
So while we're on the fescue side of things, kind of up where we're at, it gets a pretty negative connotation, just a reputation because of maybe some palatability issues. Do you guys have increased value for it, or I guess where do you see the benefits of incorporating some fescue into those pastures where you're grazing?
I mean, here in the Piedmont of North Carolina, and as you go into the western part of the state, I mean, fescue is the predominant forage. We probably wouldn't be in the grazing livestock business in this part of the country if it wasn't for fescue. And it has some benefits. I mean, there's a reason it's here, but we all know that it does have some negative impacts as well. And so it's just working with that. And I think a lot of it comes down to breeding animals that are environmentally fit. Those animals that work in our environment, that are adapted to it, and finding those ones that work in our systems. And that's true anywhere you are. You just got to find those ones that fit in, and are going to be productive in your environment. And so it's something we have to work with, and we have to be conscientious of. When we buy breeding stock, we bring animals in terms of our grazing systems. Maybe annual forages are one of those solutions or a tool that we can use to help mitigate those impacts. If you can get novel fescue established, that's great. It's relatively expensive to establish, but can certainly provide a lot of the benefits that fescue has, and take away the toxic impacts.
And I know you mentioned kind of on the sheep side of things what you guys are doing. Could you give us some background on why you're raising Katahdins, why you're raising some Dorsets down there, maybe some of the other sheep or other livestock you're kind of in charge of operating at that university farm?
Yeah, so historically, we've had Polled Dorset sheep. North Carolina State is home, the birthplace of the Polled Dorset. And so while those wool producing breeds maybe aren't quite as popular anymore in this part of the country, we want to continue on that legacy and certainly see a value for Dorset sheep in specific breeding scenarios. And so we will continue to produce them. With those, we do have a little bit more of a terminal orientation with that flock. We see them as a breed that could add some growth and muscularity to a Katahdin ewe base. And so that's kind of the direction we're going with them, and trying to breed in some parasite resistance into the Dorsets as well. And then the Katahdins, really that's where we've placed a lot of focus since I started here 3 years ago. As we all know, Katahdins are the foundation of our ewe flock in the Southeast, and we wanted to be able to replicate that with our teaching flocks and research flocks on campus. And so we've gotten into the Katahdin business, running about 75 ewes now, growing rapidly, and so really trying to get that flock established where we can utilize that to address some of the questions that you all have, and Katahdin breeders, other sheep breeders have around this part of the country. And so those are our two primary breeds. And then from there, we do have some Suffolk sheep as well that are utilized as research animals for another faculty's research objectives. Those animals are housed in full confinement due to their parasite susceptibility. And that also provides an awesome teaching opportunity for our students and producers to learn about keeping sheep inside, because I know, this is the Grazing Sheep podcast, but there's lots of producers out there that do raise sheep in more of a confinement based scenario. And so we're able to, teach some of that as well. And then we do have some goats. We've got about 30 to 35 head of crossbred does, Boer Kiko crossbred does that we use for teaching, as well as some extension projects as well.
I would think those would be best for teaching how to build good fence.
It's a constant struggle.
So to Tom's point, how often are you guys moving the goats, and what issues have you had?
Yeah, so the goats, they get moved as needed, probably not as frequently or as intensively as the sheep. We do have, I think, like most people, challenges with keeping the goats contained. I don't think, I don't think you can make a fence too hot for goats. I think, if it doesn't contain water, I'm not sure it'll contain a goat. And so, that's we have the same challenges as many others have with that. We move them where we can, when we can. We try to keep them on some pretty hot fence in areas where we can minimize their chances for getting into trouble.
Yeah, so two things, just kind of the background, what you guys are doing there. Could you explain on the confinement side of things, maybe some opportunities, not only in North Carolina, but in the southeastern part of the country with some other animal entities that the sheep industry can take advantage of?
Yeah, and certainly there are opportunities for confinement production. We've got a lot of poultry houses that are being retired, I should say. That's probably the best way to put it. The producers, they still want to farm. They want to continue to raise livestock, but maybe in terms of cost to keep them up to standards for the poultry companies, maybe that's not economically advantageous anymore. But there's still a building that still has a roof and can potentially be adequate for housing sheep. And so we've had a lot of questions. We've got a few producers that are already doing it, others that are asking about it and trying to figure out the logistics of it. We also have a few scenarios related to the swine industry and some nursery barns that are no longer being utilized, that folks are looking into putting some sheep in as well. I always tell folks, just put a budget together, look at what it's going to cost to manage those animals in confinement. Certainly our cheapest feed source is that grass that's grown out in our pastures. And so when we're not able to provide that and we have to provide more expensive feedstuffs, we certainly need to consider that and consider the economics and make sure that it makes sense to do that. But it's something that I think should be considered and explored, and for the right person in the right place with the right resources could certainly work.
Then the other question I had, you'd mentioned the Dorsets operating as a terminal sire. Do you want to share kind of what your trait selection is on that terminal sire? You mentioned, when we think Dorset sheep, first thing I think of, and probably those that were developed, the Poll Dorset there at NC State, were more maternal in their design and makeup and kind of functionality. So when you're looking at terminal traits, I guess, what are you guys selecting for? And is that just phenotypic evaluation? This one appears to have the greatest carcass attributes that will pass on to offspring, or any other genetic tools you're utilizing?
So on the Dorset side of things, the Dorset is technically classified as a dual purpose breed. And so there's certainly folks taking it in either direction. There's some folks, kind of chasing the maternal side, and I think in the right production system, maybe more of like a Midwest type system, those maternal attributes could certainly be advantageous in terms of seasonality, milk production, and things like that. Here in our systems here in the Southeast, the Dorset does kind of fit a little bit more of a terminal role. And so we're really looking at, weight gain as well as muscularity. We want sheep that hit that lightweight land market as fast as possible, and do so while producing carcasses that are shapely, that are going to grade well and earn some premiums in our graded sales. And so, stoutness and shape is certainly advantageous, and we make a lot of those selection decisions utilizing the eye muscle depth, the EBV. And so we use those genetic tools and try to breed those animals that hopefully are going to have increased muscularity as well as some added growth. And of course, those two traits are combined in our Carcass Plus Index, which is our terminal index provided through NSIP. And so we also, obviously paying attention to that index and trying to increase that in our Dorset flock.
So you mentioned EBV. Do you want to share with us kind of what that is? I know we're maybe running out of time here, but just touch on the basics and how you guys are utilizing those and the value you see in that for the commercial sheep industry in the U.S.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep this relatively short, and maybe we can get together another time and dive into a little bit more detail if you all would like. But an EBV, an estimated breeding value, is simply a measure of genetic merit. And so we think about some other traits. Let's just use, we're all sheep producers, scrapie resistance. And so we think about that codon 171, we think about the Qs and the Rs, and that's a relatively simple trait, and one that we can use a couple different letters, and we can denote those animals that are more resistant or more susceptible. These traits like parasite resistance, growth, prolificacy, they're much more complex traits that are controlled by a variety of genes, many, many, many genes. And so to use letters to try to represent that would be extremely difficult. And so instead, we use quantitative tools and metrics. So essentially, we use numbers to represent that genotype. And so really all an EBV is a number that represents that animal's genotype, their genetic makeup for a given trait. And so really we can think about it as simply as that. When you see that number that's in a sale catalog or your NSIP printout, or you're looking to buy some rams and a producer offers you a spreadsheet with some EBVs on it, each one of those numbers simply represents the genotype, the genetics of that animal for that given trait. And so we can use those to compare one animal to another. They won't tell you exactly how an animal is going to perform. Rather, an EBV tells you the relative differences between animals in terms of expected performance. And so those EBVs are available for a variety of different traits, and they do represent genotype and not a phenotype, which is where they really have their power. An EBV is calculated based on not only an individual's performance, but also the performance and the genetics of their sire and dam, their grandparents, all related individuals. It takes into account any sibling data, half sibs, full sibs, takes into account progeny data, as well as genetic correlations between traits. And some traits may influence another trait. And so that's all accounted for in the calculation of those breeding values. So because there's so much information that's taken into account when calculating this one single number, these breeding values are far more accurate than the raw metrics that we measure on farm. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't keep records. Records are essential to providing a benchmark in terms of the performance of our animals and our flocks. But that's just the starting point. And then in terms of making selection decisions, those breeding values are really our most powerful tool.
Well, thank you for that explanation. And we are kind of up here on our time. You got something else you want to add there, Cam?
No, just want to say thank you for kind of sharing what you're doing down there in the southeastern part of the state. It's always interesting to talk about some forage varieties and just practical applications of information to what we can kind of implement and maybe those specific to that region can implement. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it. Always enjoy talking about both forages as well as genetics, and learning from you all as well, and other producers around the country, and hearing about their production systems, what forages they're using. I learn a lot from you all, and the rest of the producers here too. So and enjoyed joining you all this evening, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you all for listening to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. We'd like to especially thank Dr. Andrew Weaver from North Carolina State University for being here with us. If you have any questions or comments or something you'd like to hear us talk about in the future, you can do that by reaching out to me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. And so it's been good catching up with you, Cam, and good catching up with you, Dr. Weaver. And we'll talk to you all later.
Sounds good, Tom.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All righty. Bye.